January 1944. High above the central Pacific, the sky thins into a pale, almost colorless blue. At over 35,000 feet, the air is no longer forgiving. Metal stiffens. Engines strain. Breath itself becomes a managed resource. An American fighter cruises alone, well above the altitude most pilots are instructed to use in combat. Frost creeps along the canopy frame. The oxygen mask presses hard against the pilot's face. Each breath measured, deliberate. Below him, far beneath the glare of the sun, a wide formation begins to take shape. Sleek, white-winged silhouettes moving with practiced confidence. Mitsubishi A6M Zeros, dozens of them. 36 aircraft hold formation, certain of their advantage. At lower altitudes, they are unmatched, agile, deadly, and feared. Their pilots do not look up. Doctrine tells them there is nothing up there that can threaten them. But above them, a single pilot from Texas is watching. Watching the spacing. Watching the speed. Waiting for gravity, altitude, and physics to do what dogfighting rules say they should not. As the sun shifts behind his wing, he begins to roll his aircraft into position, setting in motion a decision that will rewrite how this fight is understood. By the opening months of 1944, the air war over the Pacific had already written a brutal record of learning through loss. 2 years earlier, in the chaotic aftermath of Pearl Harbor, American pilots had entered combat facing an enemy that appeared untouchable in the air. The Mitsubishi A6M Zero was not just a fighter, it was a revelation. Lightweight, long-ranged, and extraordinarily maneuverable at low and medium altitudes, it turned tighter than anything the United States Army, Air Forces, or Navy could initially field in theater. In early encounters over the Philippines, the Dutch East Indies, and the skies above Guadalcanal, American formations were torn apart by Japanese pilots trained in pre-war aerial doctrine that emphasized individual mastery and aggressive turning combat. The Zero thrived in this environment. It could climb quickly, sustain tight turns without stalling, and remain airborne for hours. For American pilots accustomed to heavier aircraft, the first months of combat were disorienting and deadly. Losses mounted. By mid-1942 U.S., commanders were forced to confront an uncomfortable truth. Traditional dogfighting tactics were failing. Aircraft like the P-40 Warhawk and early-model F-4F Wildcats were rugged and well-armed, but they could not outturn the Zero. When pilots tried, the result was often fatal. Japanese gunners, firing from close range, exploited the lack of armor and self-sealing fuel tanks in American planes less often than Americans discovered the same vulnerabilities in their enemy, because they rarely survived long enough to learn them. Out of this failure came adaptation. Intelligence officers studied wreckage. Surviving pilots compared notes. Reports from the Aleutians and from captured aircraft revealed something critical. The Zero's strengths were not universal. Its design sacrificed protection for agility. Its engine lacked the high-altitude supercharging systems found in newer American fighters. Above a certain altitude, its climb rate faltered, its control surfaces stiffened, and its engine performance degraded rapidly. Yet knowing a weakness and exploiting it were two different things. Early in the Pacific War, American doctrine discouraged high-altitude engagement in the region. Weather patterns were unpredictable. Navigation errors were common. Oxygen systems were unreliable. Above 30,000 feet, mechanical failure could be as deadly as enemy fire. By 1943, the strategic situation had begun to shift. The United States was no longer reacting. It was advancing. The island-hopping campaign pushed airfields ever closer to Japanese-held territory. With each new base came longer missions, higher altitude transits, and new aircraft designed to operate where earlier fighters could not. The Lockheed P-38 Lightning, with its twin engines and turbo superchargers, entered the theater in force. It could climb high, dive fast, and retain energy in ways that fundamentally changed the geometry of air combat. Still, habit and doctrine are slow to die. Even as aircraft performance improved, many pilots were instructed to stay within altitude bands considered safe and tactically sound. High-altitude solo operations were viewed as unnecessary risks, especially against an enemy known for ambush and numerical superiority. It was within this environment, where old rules persisted alongside new capabilities, that a small number of pilots began quietly pushing beyond prescribed limits. Not out of recklessness, but out of calculation. They understood that altitude was not just a position in the sky. It was stored energy. And in the Pacific, where the Zero reigned supreme below, the thin air above offered something rare: surprise. That understanding would soon collide with a formation of 36 Japanese fighters, waiting, unknowingly, beneath a sky they believed was empty. The shift in air combat over the Pacific was not driven by courage alone. It was driven by engineering. By late 1943, American aircraft arriving in theater reflected 2 years of hard-earned lessons. Speed, altitude, and firepower were no longer treated as optional advantages. They were survival tools. Among these aircraft, the Lockheed P-38 Lightning stood apart. Its distinctive twin-boom design housed two Allison V-17 1000TN engines, each equipped with turbo superchargers capable of maintaining power at altitudes where single-engine fighters struggled to breathe. At 30,000 feet and above, the P-38 did not merely function. It retained the ability to climb, accelerate, and dive with authority. In the vast distances of the Pacific, it also offered long range, allowing pilots to escort bombers or patrol areas far beyond the reach of earlier fighters. But with these advantages came complexity. The P-38 was unforgiving to careless handling. Compressibility issues at high-speed dives could lock control surfaces. Engines required careful management. Oxygen systems were essential and temperamental. At extreme altitudes, a failure in any one system could render the aircraft uncontrollable within seconds. For many commanders, these risks reinforced existing caution. The Lightning was powerful, yes, but only within boundaries. Japanese aircraft design reflected a different philosophy. The A6M Zero prioritized maneuverability and range above all else. Its Nakajima Sakai engine performed efficiently at lower altitudes, where air density supported tight turns and rapid throttle response. The aircraft's light construction gave it an astonishing turn radius, but also left it vulnerable. It lacked armor plate. Its fuel tanks were not self-sealing. A single well-placed burst could ignite it. The challenge was delivering that burst without being pulled into a turning fight that favored the Zero. Japanese doctrine assumed the battle would remain where their aircraft excelled. Their pilots were trained to lure opponents into horizontal engagements, bleeding speed and altitude until the enemy was trapped. Above 25,000 feet, however, the Zero's performance declined sharply. Climb rate fell. Control response slowed. Oxygen systems for Japanese pilots were less robust, and prolonged high-altitude operations were uncommon. American intelligence was aware of these limitations, But official guidance lagged behind field experience. High-altitude engagements were considered inefficient. Visual identification was harder. Formation cohesion suffered. Solo attacks, especially against numerically superior enemy groups, were actively discouraged. Pilots were instructed to fight as units, maintain altitude discipline, and avoid unnecessary deviation. It was in this gap, between what doctrine prescribed and what physics allowed, that individual judgment began to matter. The Texas pilot at the center of this story was not unique in skill, but he was unusual in temperament. Raised far from the ocean, he had learned early to trust distance, timing, and preparation. He was methodical in the air, patient to the point of stubbornness. While others hunted at standard altitudes, he climbed higher, testing engine limits, monitoring oxygen flow, feeling how his aircraft behaved where the sky thinned and sound seemed to fade. His superiors did not forbid such climbs outright, but they did not encourage them either. Officially, there was little tactical value in being alone above the fight. Unofficially, pilots understood that survival often depended on seeing the enemy first. Altitude granted that vision. By January 1944, American forces were pressing deeper into the Central Pacific. Japanese air units, though diminished, remained dangerous. They still flew in numbers. They still believed in the Zero. And on that clear morning, 36 of those aircraft lifted into the air under assumptions that had not yet caught up with the changing reality above them. What followed would not be decided by turning circles or formation doctrine, but by how one pilot understood altitude as a weapon. High-altitude combat stripped aviation of its romance. Above 30,000 feet, the cockpit became a confined chamber of discipline and restraint. The Texas pilot felt this immediately. Every movement was slower. Gloves stiffened. Instruments demanded constant attention. A lapse of focus at that altitude could lead not to damage, but to silence. Engine flameout, oxygen deprivation, unconsciousness. Unlike lower-altitude dogfights filled with twisting motion and split-second reflex, this kind of engagement began long before the enemy appeared. It began with preparation. Oxygen checks. Fuel mixture adjustments. Engine temperatures watched obsessively. The pilot's world narrowed to gauges, breath, and the slow passing of time. Isolation was not a byproduct. It was a requirement. No wingman could easily follow him that high without risk. The psychological strain was constant. There was no radio chatter, no visual confirmation of friendly aircraft, only the faint hum of engines and the knowledge that one mistake could turn altitude from advantage into a fatal trap. Yet it was precisely this solitude that sharpened his awareness. From above, the enemy would be visible minutes before they could react. Patience replaced aggression. Observation replaced instinct. This was not bravado. It was calculation. And it demanded a kind of endurance that training manuals rarely addressed. Altitude favored the prepared machine. The P-38 Lightning, when properly handled, transformed height into stored energy. At cruising altitude, it held potential speed that could be converted instantly into momentum. Gravity became a weapon. A steep dive from above 35,000 feet could push the aircraft beyond 400 miles per hour in seconds, far faster than a Zero could respond. Japanese fighters were not designed for this domain. Their engines, optimized for range and maneuverability, lost power rapidly as air thinned. Control surfaces stiffened. Acceleration lagged. A Zero pilot climbing toward a high-altitude attacker would find himself slow, exposed, and unable to maneuver effectively. The Lightning's concentrated nose-mounted armament added another dimension. 4 50-caliber machine guns and a 20-meter cannon fired straight ahead, eliminating convergence issues. In a high-speed dive, this meant a brief firing window, but one capable of catastrophic damage if properly timed. Technology did not guarantee success. Compressibility effects in the P-38 could lock elevators in a dive, making recovery uncertain. Many pilots feared pushing their aircraft into that regime, but in the hands of someone who understood the margins, altitude turned technological risk into tactical dominance. Traditional dogfighting relied on proximity and turning ability. High-altitude attack inverted those assumptions. The goal was not to outturn the enemy, but to never give them the chance. From above, the pilot chose when to engage, how long to remain in firing range, and when to disengage. Against 36 Zeros, this approach bordered on heresy. Doctrine emphasized numerical awareness and formation integrity. Solo attacks were seen as wasteful, even suicidal. Yet at altitude, numbers compressed into geometry. The formation below became a pattern, predictable, slow to react, constrained by physics. The tactic depended on discipline. Full, one pass, one burst. Then climb away using excess energy before the enemy could respond. Repeat if conditions allowed. It was not about defeating all opponents at once. It was about dismantling certainty. And certainty, once broken, spread faster than gunfire. As the Texas pilot steadied his aircraft above the sunlit formation, these angles, human, technological, tactical, aligned into a single decision point that would soon demand commitment. From the perspective of the Japanese pilots below, the sky was behaving as expected. Visibility was clear. Formation spacing was standard. No American fighters were detected at their operating altitude. For Zero pilots trained in visual acquisition and close-range maneuvering, this absence confirmed safety rather than threat. The enemy, if present, would appear at eye level or below, never above. Japanese air doctrine still emphasized mutual support within formations, but it also relied heavily on pilot confidence. Many of these aviators had survived earlier campaigns. They trusted the Zero's reputation. They trusted the sky beneath them. What they did not account for was an opponent who had chosen to fight where their aircraft and training offered no immediate answer. When the first American fighter appeared, it did not arrive in the usual way. There was no turning challenge, no climb to meet. It fell out of the sun in silence, velocity doing what maneuverability could not. By the time warning shouts moved through Japanese radios, the geometry of the encounter had already collapsed. Air combat doctrine is written for averages, not exceptions. In early Pacific operations, commanders emphasized cohesion and predictability because chaos favored the Zero. These rules saved lives, but they also constrained innovation. High-altitude solo tactics fell into a gray area, not forbidden by regulation, but discouraged through culture. The Texas pilot's choice to operate above prescribed altitude bands was a quiet defiance of expectation. Not disobedience, but interpretation. He adhered to mission objectives while rejecting assumptions about where combat had to occur. In doing so, he exploited a lag between what aircraft could do and what doctrine allowed. After-action reports from similar encounters were often vague, downplayed, or filed without emphasis. Commanders were cautious about endorsing tactics that relied on exceptional skill or machinery. But results carried weight. Every Zero destroyed without loss forced reconsideration, however reluctant. Engaging 36 enemy fighters alone was not an act of recklessness. It was a wager made with full awareness of the consequences. If the attack failed, there would be no rescue. No formation to cover withdrawal. No margin for error in engine management or recovery. This was the moral burden of initiative in wartime aviation. Success would be attributed to circumstance. Failure would be personal. The pilot understood this. He accepted that his decisions would be judged not by intent, but by outcome. As he aligned his aircraft above the Japanese formation, he was not thinking in terms of heroism. He was thinking in terms of angles, speeds, and timing. The moral question whether one man should challenge so many was already answered by the physics of altitude and the narrowing distance between attacker and target. The moment for abstraction ended as gravity began to pull him forward. Below, 36 Zeros flew on, unaware that the turning point of their mission was already descending toward them. The clock inside the cockpit marked just after mid-morning. At altitude, time felt distorted. Seconds stretched thin, unhurried, while the world below moved with deceptive calm. The Texas pilot eased his aircraft forward, nose dipping almost imperceptibly at first. Airspeed began to build. The engine note deepened. Gravity took over. At 35,000 feet, the dive started as a controlled descent. Within moments, it became something else entirely. The P-38 accelerated rapidly, the altimeter unwinding faster than the eye could track. Cold air screamed along the fuselage. Control pressure stiffened as compressibility effects edged closer to their limits. The pilot did not fight it. He anticipated it, holding just enough authority to keep the aircraft aligned. The Japanese formation grew larger, resolving from shapes into individual aircraft. 36 Zeros, arranged in layered elements, cruising comfortably. None maneuvered. None climbed. They had not seen him. At approximately 22,000 feet, the Lightning crossed into firing range. The pilot selected a single aircraft on the outer edge of the formation, slightly lower, marginally separated. He waited, not for courage, but for geometry. The sun was behind him. Closure rate was extreme. At 800 yards, he opened fire. The nose-mounted guns spoke as one. Tracers arced briefly, then disappeared into the target. The Zero erupted almost instantly. Fuel igniting, structure failing, the aircraft breaking apart before its pilot could react. There was no prolonged fight, no exchange. 1 second it was there, the next it was gone. The pilot did not stay to watch. He pulled up sharply, converting speed back into altitude. The G-forces pressed him into the seat as the P-38 clawed upward, engines straining but steady. Below, the Japanese formation scattered in confusion. Radios erupted with warnings. Aircraft broke formation, some climbing blindly, others diving in opposite directions. The first pass had shattered certainty. Within seconds, the Texas pilot was climbing back toward his original altitude, already scanning for the next opening. The rules of engagement had been broken, but the fight had only just begun. High above the chaos he had created, the sky once again offered silence. And in that silence, he prepared to strike again, knowing that each dive would tighten the margin, and each second would matter more than the last. Confusion spread faster than coordination. The Japanese formation no longer moved as a single body. Elements fractured, pilots reacting on instinct rather than instruction. Some Zeros attempted to climb, engines straining as they pointed their noses into thinner air that offered no forgiveness. Others rolled into defensive turns, searching for an opponent they could not yet see. Above them, the Texas pilot leveled briefly, checking instruments with practiced speed. Oil pressure steady. Engine temperatures within margin. Oxygen flow constant. Ammunition remaining, enough for several short passes, but not indulgence. There would be no prolonged firing. Each engagement had to end before the enemy could respond. He rolled inverted and began the second dive. This time, the enemy was alert. But alertness did not equal readiness. The lightning fell through the sun again, faster now, steeper. Japanese pilots glimpsed a silver shape crossing their canopy at impossible speed. Tracers followed too late. The Texas pilot selected another aircraft, this one climbing, slow and exposed. A short burst. The Zero's wings separated cleanly, spiraling away as the fuselage followed. He pulled out hard, feeling the controls resist, then release as air density increased. The P-38 shuddered, then answered. He climbed. The pattern repeated. Dive. Fire. Break away. Climb. With each pass, the Japanese formation lost cohesion. Two Zeros collided while attempting to evade. Another went into a terminal dive after overcorrecting at high speed. Pilots who tried to follow the lightning upward found themselves stalling, then falling back into the melee below. Altitude, once ignored, now mocked them. The Texas pilot did not count kills in the moment. There was no time. He counted seconds. He counted ammunition bursts. He watched the sky for threats. Any Zero that managed to anticipate his climb path, any tracer rising toward him. None did. The geometry remained cruelly one-sided. By the sixth pass, the engagement had ceased to resemble a battle. It had become a series of isolated failures cascading through the Japanese formation. Aircraft burned. Smoke trails marked spirals toward the ocean. Radios fell silent as command structure collapsed. When the final Zero broke away, diving eastward in full retreat, the pilot did not pursue. His fuel state would not allow it. His ammunition was nearly gone. He eased the Lightning back into a steady climb, then leveled off, alone once more in the thin blue sky. Below him, the airspace was empty. Post-mission analysis would later confirm the scale of what had occurred. 36 Zeros had entered the engagement. None remained operational over the area. Some destroyed directly, others lost to collision, loss of control, or fuel fires ignited by brief, precise bursts. For the Texas pilot, the fight ended not with celebration, but with silence. He turned toward home, engines humming evenly, altitude once again his shield. The consequences of that silence would not remain confined to the sky. The return flight was uneventful, and that, more than anything, unsettled the ground crews when the P-38 touched down. There was no damage to the airframe. No visible signs of struggle. The cockpit, frosted from extreme altitude, held only the faint odor of burned ammunition and oil. The pilot climbed out, oxygen mask removed, face pale from the sustained tension of high-altitude operations. He carried no trophies, no fanfare, only the knowledge that 36 enemy aircraft had been neutralized in a single calculated engagement. reports began to filter back through command channels. Initially, skepticism greeted the claim. Could one pilot, operating alone at extreme altitude, really have destroyed an entire formation? Cross-referencing Japanese radio intercepts, mission logs, and post-battle reconnaissance confirmed something remarkable. The losses were real, verifiable, and substantial. Wreckage fell into the Pacific, traced to multiple locations consistent with high-altitude dive attacks. Survivor testimonies from other Japanese units noted the sudden, inexplicable assault and the near-complete disintegration of formation cohesion. The strategic implications were immediate. American commanders, though cautious to credit disobedience to doctrine, recognized that the P-38's high-altitude capability allowed engagement in a domain the Japanese were ill-prepared to contest. This single engagement demonstrated that altitude could be leveraged as both a defensive buffer and an offensive advantage, if used intelligently and conservatively. The pilot himself, however, remained largely anonymous. His superiors filed reports that emphasized tactical success without highlighting the unorthodox methods. Military culture valued results, but it also valued adherence to prescribed procedures. A lesson had been learned quietly. Doctrine could lag behind technology, and individual initiative could exploit that lag, but at personal risk. Meanwhile, Japanese forces reassessed their patrol patterns. Formations at medium altitude were still standard, but reports circulated of aircraft disappearing from high skies without warning. Pilots now had to consider the possibility of an adversary lurking above, exploiting gravity and engine power in a way previously thought impractical. The engagement also marked a subtle shift in American tactical philosophy. Observers noted that altitude, previously treated as a transit corridor or observation post, could become a lethal tool. Subsequent missions increasingly incorporated vertical tactics, with pilots trained to use the energy advantage of height for both attack and escape. This understanding, however, came at a human cost. Pilots attempting similar tactics without proper preparation often failed. The balance between innovation and survival remained fragile. Briefings emphasized the potential of energy tactics, yet cautioned against indiscriminate solo climbs. The Texas pilot's success was acknowledged, but framed carefully. It was an example of what was possible under ideal conditions, not a template for standard procedure. Manuals began to note altitude as a strategic consideration, but formal doctrine would take months to catch up. Japanese forces, already stretched thin across the Central Pacific, faced both material and psychological repercussions. The destruction of 36 Zeros in a single encounter was a blow to morale and operational readiness. Replacement aircraft were limited, and trained pilots were irreplaceable. Enemy commanders began to alter flight patterns, enforce tighter formation discipline, and allocate more resources to altitude monitoring. Yet the fundamental disadvantage of the Zero at high altitude could not be corrected in hardware alone. For the pilot himself, the aftermath was quieter. Returning to his unit, he resumed patrols and escort missions, his actions largely unremarked except by those who witnessed the engagement firsthand. He did not seek recognition. It was unnecessary. The P-38 continued to operate in the theater, increasingly trusted to perform tasks beyond what doctrine had previously allowed. Each mission confirmed that altitude could be as decisive as firepower, and that one skilled pilot, operating with patience and precision, could challenge even overwhelming numbers. The incident became a quiet case study for instructors and tacticians. It illustrated that air combat was not solely about numbers, nor even agility. It was about understanding the interaction of human skill, technology, and physics. Energy management, positional advantage, and timing became core considerations for advanced fighter training. In the quiet aftermath, the significance of that day remained clear yet subtle. The Texas pilots' actions did not merely tally kills. They demonstrated a fundamental truth about air warfare. Altitude was not a passive backdrop, but a weapon in its own right. By mastering his aircraft and trusting his judgment over rigid doctrine, he transformed physics into a tactical advantage, showing that initiative could redefine the battlefield. The encounter also highlighted the human dimension of combat. Courage alone was insufficient. Precision, patience, and acute awareness of both machine and environment were decisive. Operating where others feared to go, he relied on skill, training, and careful observation rather than brute force. In doing so, he exemplified the intersection of human ingenuity and technological potential. For the broader war, this moment signaled a shift. The dominance of the Zero, once unquestioned, could be challenged not only by superior aircraft, but by a sophisticated understanding of energy and positioning. Tactics evolved, and so did the expectations placed upon pilots. Each subsequent mission carried the echoes of that engagement, proof that a single individual, guided by reason and daring, could alter the outcome of larger operations. And yet, the event retained a quiet dignity. There was no fanfare, no celebrated speech, just a pilot, a machine, and the sky. History would record the numbers and the strategic consequences, but the enduring lesson was philosophical. In war, as in life, understanding the forces around you and knowing when to rise above them can change everything. The Pacific sky, once a domain of predictable power, had become a canvas for innovation, audacity, and the careful exploitation of nature's own rules. The echoes of that day would resonate far beyond the immediate battle, shaping air combat philosophy and reminding all who flew that the edge of the sky could also be the edge of possibility.